The wind had been howling all night, but it wasn't the kind of wind that just screamed through a few pine tops and moved on. No, this one had a sharp edge, a murderous mind. It scraped along the valley like it wanted to flay the earth itself. When morning came, it didn't bring warmth, just more frost, more silence, and the body of a calf half frozen in the drift behind Eleanor Vance's barn. A few of the neighbors came trudging up the slope not to help, but to see if she'd finally given up. She hadn't. Eleanor stood at the barn door, one boot planted firm in the ice-packed ground, and stared them down with that same hollow-eyed grit she'd carried since the war took her husband and the fever took her boy. She didn't speak, just lifted the calf, still warm enough to breathe, into a blanket-lined sling and vanished into the wall of the barn. But what those men didn't see, and wouldn't for weeks, was where she went after that. She didn't go to the hayloft, not the tack room, not even the main stall. Eleanor disappeared behind a door flush with the wall, nearly invisible from the outside, where wood met stone and frost hid the seams. That door led to a room no one else knew about, a room she'd started digging 3 winters ago. They said it was foolish. They called it paranoid. One man laughed so hard about it at the general store, he nearly choked on his tobacco. But Eleanor had remembered the winter of '71 too clearly to leave anything to chance again. That was the winter she lost everything but her mind. Back then, her baby had lasted 4 days after the chimney froze over. Her husband's lungs had gone black before she could split the last log, and when the first thaw came, she buried both of them and burned what was left of the cabin. She couldn't sleep in it anymore, not with the silence in every room. She left and built something new, not pretty, not high, just smart. Low, thick walls, a small roof, 2 outbuildings, a barn dug partly into the hillside, and a stovepipe that didn't smoke unless she let it. Most folks never even saw the second chimney. The secret room had been her quiet obsession. Each spring, she'd carved deeper into the hill behind the barn. When the dirt was soft, when nobody noticed her hauling wheelbarrow loads behind the furs, she reinforced the walls with stone, sealed them with mud and horsehair, and lined the floor with salvaged metal scraps and flat river rocks that held heat like a stove plate. No windows, just one low sloped ceiling and a single steel stove set dead center. Heat didn't rise in there, it lingered. She called it the warm room. No one else even knew to call it anything. That first winter she finished it, she lived through the cold without burning half her woodpile. The next, she dried apples and smoked meat in it. Come last year, she nursed an injured dog back to life in that room. It held warmth like a womb. But when she mentioned it to anyone, even in vague terms, men laughed. Women gave her those sad, sideways looks, the kind they used when a widow got a little too clever for her own good. Now it was February again, and the storms hadn't broken in 10 days. The sky stayed like lead. No sun, no stars, just the scream of wind in the chimneys, and the smell of old snow thick with death. Folks had started talking about the freeze like it was something alive, something cruel. By the 3rd day, without fresh bread or milk, the McClary boys were seen walking toward town, with their fingers wrapped in rags, eyes hollow as frostbitten cattle. The Smiths' barn burned to the ground after a stove popped. The Thompsons lost their 2 youngest, no one saying much but everyone knowing they'd been found stiff as firewood in bed. That morning someone knocked on Eleanor's door, not with the boldness of judgment, but the brittleness of desperation. It was Jonah Thompson. He was 13, pale, missing a mitten, his lips split down the center. His father was behind him, shoulders hunched like the cold had bent them permanently. They didn't ask for food. They didn't ask for wood. They just said, "We heard you might have a warm place." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked at Jonah's fingers, then at the man behind him. Both of them were shaking, but not from fear, just cold, deep cold that settled into the marrow and wouldn't let go. Behind them, the wind kicked up again and flung dust into the grey sky. She stepped aside and pointed toward the barn. Jonah hesitated. "The barn?" Eleanor gave one nod. "You'll see. Inside, it looked like any other barn, just more neatly kept. A rope hung loose from a hook, buckets of frozen water stacked by the wall. She led them toward the back and reached behind a beam where the slats were uneven. A latch clicked. The hidden door opened with a soft groan of hinges that hadn't seen daylight in months. Heat rolled out like breath from a beast. The 2 stepped inside. Jonah almost collapsed from the sudden shift in temperature. He started crying and tried to hide it. Eleanor handed him a blanket from the shelf and let him settle into the low cot by the stove. There was no laughter now. Word spread fast. By the end of the next day, there were 3 more knocks. One by a midwife whose cabin had caved in, another by a rail worker's wife who hadn't seen her husband in 6 days, and the third, quietest of all, from a woman named Marion Stokes, who hadn't spoken to Eleanor since the day she called her foolish for planning to dig like a prairie rat. Eleanor didn't say anything when she opened the door for Marion, just pointed toward the barn. Inside the warm room, a small community began to form, quiet, wary, and unsure of how long the invitation would last. Eleanor didn't make speeches. She didn't take questions. She cooked stew when there was meat and boiled root water when there wasn't. She rationed wood. She rotated the sleeping spots. And most importantly, she said nothing when the faces grew more desperate and the storms didn't stop. By the 7th day, they were 10 in that room. By the 9th, 15. Some of them tried to bring news of towns cut off, rivers iced so thick no one could break them, of wagons tipped in snow and bodies half dug from drifts. One man said a family had frozen mid-meal in the northern valley, spoons still in hand. The warm room didn't echo with these stories. Its walls held the heat and swallowed the sound. It became something sacred, a womb carved by grief, a tomb of survival, a chamber where no one asked why Eleanor had built it. Not anymore. One evening, long past midnight, Eleanor stood outside in the dark. Snow blanketed everything, even the moonlight. She looked at the barn's side, at the nearly invisible seams, and listened, not to the wind, but to the muffled sound of 15 lives breathing safely inside. No one called her paranoid now. By the 10th day, the wind had learned new tricks. It didn't just push against walls, it seeped through cracks that shouldn't have existed, through timbers that had stood dry for decades. It had a wet edge to it now, a gnawing cold, heavy with ice, like the sky itself had turned to teeth. The plains were no longer white, they were blue, the kind of blue you only see on bruises and deathbeds. Out in that nightmare, cabins were falling quiet one by one. A chimney that had always smoked now stayed cold. A porch door flapped open in the gusts, with no one coming to close it. The dogs had stopped barking. But behind the seamless wall of Eleanor's barn, the warm room glowed. It wasn't joyful inside. No one sang. No one told stories by firelight like in those dime novels. It was survival, pure and simple. The people who'd come, begging at first, now silent, sat on blankets or lay curled together under pelts. They watched the tiny stove, and they watched Eleanor. Always Eleanor, the woman who had once been called strange, paranoid, touched in the head. Now she was simply the one who knew. She hadn't smiled since the third person arrived. That had been Ruth Harlan, thin, proud, one leg wrapped in bloodied cloth and eyes glassy with infection. Eleanor had moved fast then. She'd stoked the stove hotter, boiled rags in the kettle, and dosed Ruth with herbs she'd ground herself last summer. Ruth survived, but her silence said she understood that she might not have. That same day, a baby was born in the warm room. Came 2 weeks early. The mother was a rail worker's wife, barely out of girlhood. The contractions hit fast, and Eleanor had no choice but to act. She cleared a space by the stones, handed out boiled water, and barked orders with a voice like a strike of flint. No one argued. They were too scared the warmth might vanish if they said the wrong thing. The child came into the world quiet, too quiet, but after a slap and a prayer, it wailed, a sound so sudden and full, it filled the whole room like sunrise. Someone sobbed, someone else muttered a prayer. Eleanor said nothing. She just bundled the baby and placed it against the mother's chest. That night, no one slept. They all knew what the cold did to babies. But morning came, and the child still breathed. It wasn't just bodies that found their way to Eleanor's door now. Stories came too. Whispers, warnings, some barely made sense. A man arrived from the far edge of the valley with one eye swollen shut and frost-bitten toes. He said there were wolves, hundreds of them, circling empty homesteads like they knew which ones had gone silent. A girl spoke of hearing music, real music, from deep beneath the snow. Another swore that someone had been walking through the storm at night, lantern swinging, barefoot. Eleanor listened, but she didn't indulge it. She'd learned long ago that cold played tricks on minds. Delirium could dress itself up as vision, as ghosts, as prophecy. The only things that mattered were fire, food, and shelter. All else was noise. But when the third man spoke of seeing black smoke curling from a broken chimney 5 miles west, a cabin long abandoned, whose owners had died in the last freeze, Eleanor did pause. For a long time, then she quietly took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the wall. She knew that chimney. She'd buried the couple who lived there, and she'd sealed the stovepipe herself. She didn't tell the others, just sat beside the stove and stirred the pot slower than usual. The days no longer had shape. The sun was a faint disk of dull grey. The wind refused to stop. Some days it snowed sideways. Other days the air was too thick with powder to see more than a few feet past the barn. Inside, time passed differently. The stones stayed warm long after the fire went low. Steam curled from bowls even hours after cooking. There was no singing, but there was rhythm, fire, food, silence, sleep. Eleanor kept track with notches scratched into a hidden beam behind her cot. On the 12th day, the food nearly ran out. That was the first time the silence broke, not from storm or child or footfall, but from argument. Two men, Destry Finch and Edwin Cole, had come in separately, but both had the look of men used to owning rooms. They'd taken to speaking in undertones when Eleanor wasn't around. Planning. One wanted to start rationing more aggressively. The other suggested leaving to find another storehouse. Said he knew where an old telegraph station had supplies. Eleanor heard every word. She said nothing at first, until she did. "You leave, you die," she said flatly. "You take more than your portion, we all die." Destry tried to speak, but she stepped forward. Her coat was off, her sleeves rolled up, her boots heavy with stone dust from the floor. "You think this place stays warm by luck?" she said. "You think the rocks heat themselves? You think I built this for you?" The room was silent. Even the baby stopped fussing. "I dug this with grief in my throat and blood in my hands," she said. "Every stone was set by someone who buried a child. You take one log too many, and the next baby doesn't wake up. Do you understand me?" Neither man spoke. They didn't speak again for days, but the food problem didn't fix itself. There were mouths, there was snow. There were empty shelves in the cellar tunnel Eleanor had once stocked for herself and never imagined sharing with 20 others. And so, late on the 13th night, she slipped out through the side door of the barn. She didn't tell anyone. She took only a pack, a length of rope, and the last of the jerky. The wind nearly took her eyes off in the first hour. Snow stung like glass. She kept her scarf wrapped 3 times, breathing only through the wool. Every step crunched, every gust screamed, and yet she walked. She aimed for the cabin with the sealed chimney. The snow was deep, past her knees in places. Once she fell and lay there too long, the weight of it pressing down like dirt on a grave. But she got up. The memory of her baby's frozen lips pushed her forward. It took her 3 hours to reach the old cabin. The chimney was smoking, faintly, thin black wisps curling into the sky like whispers of a lie. She crept low, used the trees for cover. The door was ajar. A strange light flickered inside. Too white, too sharp, not firelight. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She burst through the door with a rock in one hand and her knife in the other, and stopped cold. Inside was not what she expected. The fire was real, but the man before it wasn't one she knew. He wasn't frozen, wasn't afraid. He sat like someone who'd been waiting. His clothes were too clean, his face too smooth. There were cans stacked neatly on the floor, a stove full of new wood. He smiled at her like an old friend. "You finally came," he said. Eleanor didn't lower her knife. "Who are you?" she asked. He tilted his head. "You built something smart, something quiet. I've been waiting for someone like you." "I'm not interested in riddles," she snapped. But the man stood, unafraid, and placed a sealed tin on the table. "Take this. The others need it." "What is it?" "Beans," he said, "and salt, and a bit of luck." She hesitated, took the tin, backed away. He didn't follow. When she turned to leave, he said only, "The warm room works, but only if the people inside deserve it." She didn't reply. She didn't believe in ghosts, in spirits, in visions, but she carried that tin back like it was gold. And when she returned, nearly blind, frostbitten, half frozen, the door to the warm room opened before she could knock. Jonah stood there, eyes wide. "I thought you were dead," he said. She placed the tin in his hands. "Not yet," she said. The stove hissed behind him. The child cried, and deep in the walls, the stones still held their heat. The tin of beans fed 12. It wasn't much, barely a ladle each. But after near starvation, it felt like a feast. Jonah sucked the juice off his fingers. The railman's wife wept silently as she spooned tiny bites into her baby's mouth. The taste of salt alone brought 3 people near tears. No one asked where it came from. Not at first. They were all too afraid the magic would break if they named it out loud. But Eleanor's hands shook when she stirred the pot the next day. Not from cold, her blood had already paid its price, but from memory. That man in the old cabin hadn't been a dream. The blistered skin on her cheeks told her that much. But what he'd said, "The warm room works, but only if the people inside deserve it," kept spinning like an old windmill with a bent blade. Deserve. What did that even mean out here? The people in the warm room weren't saints. They weren't demons either. Just survivors. Ragged, frostbitten, desperate, clinging to whatever thread Eleanor's quiet fury had woven for them. But now, as the wind sharpened and food vanished again, something inside the room began to change. It started with murmurs. The 2 men Eleanor had warned, Destry and Edwin, were whispering again, not with voices raised, not with open challenge, but with slow, insidious logic. They eyed the pot like it was a prize. They watched Eleanor when she walked outside to relieve herself. One of them even checked the wood pile, When they thought no one noticed, she did. So did Jonah. The boy had begun shadowing her, not out of childish fear, but with the fierce loyalty of someone who'd almost died and didn't plan to do so again. He watched Destry especially, his eyes narrowed. When Eleanor caught him sitting awake after midnight, staring toward the stove, she asked him softly, "Why aren't you asleep?" Jonah just said, "Some things don't feel right." That night, Eleanor dreamed of fire. Not warm fire, consuming fire. She woke to smoke in the air, but not from the stove. Something oily, bitter. It caught her throat. By the time she rose, a candle had already sputtered out in the back corner, and Marion Stokes was coughing hard, clawing at her throat. Someone had lit something they shouldn't have. She followed the scent, burned fat, old rag, and found a shallow metal tray under a cot, glowing with embers, a homemade brazier. Someone had tried to make a personal fire inside her warm room. She didn't yell. She picked up the tray, carried it outside, and dumped it into a snowbank. Then she came back in and stared down every single soul in that room. Her voice was low, level. "If I catch anyone lighting fire in here again, you'll go out into the cold. I don't care if it's for warmth. I don't care if it's to see. You don't burn anything unless I say so. Understood?" No one moved. Even the baby went quiet. Later, Marion leaned close and whispered, "It was Destry." Eleanor nodded once. She already knew. She didn't confront him yet. That would have been a waste of strength, but something shifted inside her after that. She began to recheck the warm room's edges, feeling the stones, the seams, the corners where heat pooled. She tested the chimney pipe. She reinforced the entry latch. She moved the food stash from its hiding place beneath her cot to a crawl space above the rafters that only she could reach. The others noticed. They didn't say it out loud, but they looked at her differently now. Not just as a protector, but as a threat. A woman who might turn on them as quickly as she had defended them. And then, as if to mock them all, the weather broke. On the 14th morning, after 2 weeks of siege, the wind stopped. It didn't fade, it stopped, like the sky had forgotten to breathe. The silence was deafening. Some cried. Others blinked at the weak sun through the cracks and muttered, "It's over. It's finally over." It wasn't. The cold hadn't left. It had settled, deeper. Without the wind, the temperature plunged lower. Stillness meant stagnation. Frost crept thicker on the inside of other cabins' walls. The wood outside groaned with expanding ice, but the illusion of peace was enough to tempt some. Destry was the first to leave. He packed a bundle that night and told Edwin, loud enough for everyone to hear, "There's no future in hiding. We'll find something better in town." Eleanor didn't stop them. She didn't warn them. She just watched as they stepped into the dawn snow, faces tight, hands buried deep into their coats. They never returned. 3 days later, a girl found one of their hats tangled in a fence post 2 miles away. Nothing else. That loss should have cemented Eleanor's place again, should have silenced doubt. But grief does strange things in closed spaces, and starvation breeds suspicion. The baby had started coughing. The rail worker's wife had grown pale and thin. Ruth Harlan's leg wound smelled sweet, too sweet. Eleanor worked harder than ever, hauling in wood, boiling roots, sealing new drafts, but the air inside the warm room began to shift. It wasn't the temperature, it was the people. They started whispering when she wasn't near, watched her more than the stove. When she caught two trying to pry open the crawl space above her cot, they didn't even apologize. That night someone asked, "How much longer do we wait?" Another added, "What if she's just keeping the best for herself?" Eleanor stood, spine straight, and said, "You're alive. That's more than I promised." But they didn't want survival anymore. They wanted control, and that was when it all came undone. On the 17th night, someone tried to take the warm room. It wasn't subtle. It started with a shove. Eleanor was near the stove, refueling it, when a figure surged forward. Edwin, still here, gaunt but wild-eyed. He grabbed her shoulder and tried to drag her from the stove. "It's our fire too," he snarled. She swung a kettle into his face. It wasn't boiling. She wished it had been. He staggered, screamed. Jonah tackled him from behind. The room erupted. Shouts, screams, bodies struggling in too tight space. A child crying, a foot kicking the stove hard enough to rattle it off its base. It nearly tipped. Eleanor lunged for it. She screamed, not the stove, anything but the stove, and braced it with her shoulder. The flames hissed dangerously, then silence. Edwin was sobbing on the floor. Blood from his nose slicked the stone. Jonah crouched in a corner, shaking. No one else moved. Eleanor stood, wiped blood from her temple, and pointed to the door. "Out," she said. No one moved. She pointed again. "He goes, or I go, and you can freeze with your damn pride." There was a pause. Then Marion rose, helped Edwin up, and said, "I'll walk him out." They left. Eleanor sat down and whispered, "I'm too old for this." No one responded, but they all felt it. The warm room had survived, barely, and not because it was invincible, but because the woman who built it still knew when to fight like hell. That night she took Jonah aside. "I'm leaving in the morning." He blinked. "What?" "There's another cabin, North Ridge. Might still have root vegetables. Ah, a friend used to live there before the fever. You're going alone? Eleanor smiled, tired. You're 12. You think I'd bring you along? He flushed. I'm 13. She touched his shoulder. Then hold the room. He didn't nod, but he didn't protest. She left before dawn. This time the cold was different. Not screaming, not biting. Just there, like a grave blanket. Heavy, inevitable. She trudged for hours, found the cabin, found it buried. Took her 20 minutes just to break in. Inside, there were potatoes, rotten, yes, but salvageable, half a sack, and a letter, on the floor by the stove, addressed to her, Eleanor Vance. She hadn't told anyone she might come, but the handwriting was hers, from before, from a time she didn't remember anymore. She opened it. It said only, "You already survived. Let the others learn how." She burned the letter in the stove, carried the potatoes home, and walked slower now, because the warm room was still there, waiting. Eleanor didn't return with triumph. There was no speech, no wide arms welcoming her back like some victorious matriarch. When she reached the barn, the snow clinging to her coat like a burial shroud, she found Jonah asleep by the door, a fire still flickering low inside the warm room, and 15 faces blinking at her like she was a ghost they weren't sure they believed in anymore. She said only, "Potatoes." No one asked questions. No one dared. She peeled and boiled them in silence. Even rotten as they were, they filled the air with a scent that brought some to tears. For hours, people didn't move. They just sat inhaling, like they were scared to blink and lose it. That night, she passed out food with her own hands, piece by piece. Half a root here, a sliver there. She counted every mouth, watched every bite. Jonah never left her side. And for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, someone laughed. Not a loud laugh, not a mocking one, but a single, stunned exhale from Marion as the baby gripped her finger and kicked hard against the blanket. "Little thing stubborn," she whispered. "He's gonna live, isn't he?" Eleanor didn't smile, but she nodded. Maybe, but not all was mended. The tension in the room had changed its shape. It was no longer panic or fear. It was guilt. Shame crept around the edges now. The same people who had doubted her, plotted behind her back, spoken of taking control, were now too quiet, avoiding her eyes. No one apologized. She didn't ask them to. She knew better. When food is scarce and cold is constant, morality grows thin as paper. Still, the silence bothered her more than the cold ever had. She trusted silence when it came from hunger, from grief. But this was different. This was avoidance. Even Jonah noticed it. "They're scared of you now," he said, sitting beside her, while she patched a blanket near the stove. Eleanor looked up. "Good. I don't mean it like that." "I do." Jonah picked at the edge of his boot. "They think you'll leave again." "I might." He looked at her, not afraid, not pleading, just steady. "You won't." And she didn't, not for days. She stayed, watching, measuring, waiting for the next shift. It came on the 21st morning. There was a knock on the outer barn door, not the hidden entrance, not someone from inside, a stranger. That alone was rare enough to make every body in the room freeze. Jonah grabbed Eleanor's arm before she could move. She shook him off gently and crossed to the barn gate. "Who is it?" she called. The voice was cracked and hoarse. "Please, just warmth." She opened the door. The man who stood there was unlike any she'd seen in years. Tall, gaunt, his coat was military, union issue, but tattered and burned at the sleeves. His boots were wrong, mismatched. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, and he carried no pack. But his eyes were the strangest part. One was clear, the other was clouded over, like frost had bloomed behind the iris and never thawed. He stepped forward, then stumbled. Eleanor caught him before he hit the ground. Inside, she laid him by the stones and offered him a sip of hot root water. His hands trembled so violently the cup spilled twice. But he drank. The others watched. "Where did you come from?" she asked. He coughed, then rasped. "East, across the ridge. Place called Wilmer's Hollow." That name brought a quiet gasp. Wilmer's Hollow hadn't been spoken aloud in this valley in years. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew it had gone silent after the fires. "You're lying," someone whispered, but the man shook his head. "There's still life there, just not human." The room went still. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her, his breath misting. "Not dead, not living. They move, but they don't need. No food, no heat, just walk, like they're stuck." Jonah shifted uncomfortably. "Ghosts?" Marion asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he said, "They don't want this place to live. They hate warmth, hate breath." "I barely got out. I followed the smoke. Yours." The room was quiet. Jonah broke the silence. "Why now?" The man looked at him. "They've started walking west. That night, no one slept, not because they believed the man, but because part of them did. Eleanor sat by the stove for hours, staring into the coals. She knew what stories did in winter, how they grew wild, how desperation gave shape to shadows. But this man had frostbite in his lungs, burn marks on his sleeves. He believed what he said, and that alone was enough to chill her. The next morning, she sent Jonah and Marion to the root cellar tunnel with the last of the blankets to insulate the gaps. She reinforced the warm room's door from the inside with an extra beam. She tested the stovepipe for cracks. She also began to whisper to the rocks again, not prayers, reminders. I built you with my hands, with blood, with memory. Hold them warm, hold them safe. That night, something brushed the barn door. Just once. A long, slow drag, like a branch or a hand. Jonah heard it. He didn't speak. Neither did Eleanor. The days stretched again. The storm didn't return, but the cold deepened. Twice, Eleanor caught herself shaking even beside the stove. She blamed age, blamed hunger. But the others started shaking too. The warmth was leaking. She checked every seal, every beam, no change, but the heat wasn't holding. Then she remembered the stranger. He hadn't been seen in 2 days. When she checked the far corner, his blankets were empty. No footprints, no melted snow, no trace, just one strip of cloth from his hand left near the stones. It was ice cold. She picked it up, felt her fingers sting, and dropped it. That night, she built the fire higher than ever, fed it every log left, and when the room glowed so bright the stones steamed, she sat with her back to the door and her knife in hand. Jonah curled beside the baby, arms tight around the swaddled bundle. Eleanor whispered again to the stones, "You don't belong to death, not yet," and the stones listened. For now, the morning came slow, like a wounded thing. The snow outside had settled into a false stillness, its surface crusted with a layer of brittle ice. Eleanor hadn't slept, neither had Jonah. The fire had burned nearly all night, but the warmth was fading faster now. Not gone, but thinner. It didn't sink into the stones like before. It hovered. Hovering heat meant one thing. The room was being drained, not by draft, not by physics, by something else. She could feel it. Every time the shadows near the corners bent oddly, every time the air felt watched, every time Jonah's eyes widened for no reason, and he whispered, "Did you hear that?" No one else had. It was the 25th day. Outside, nothing moved. Inside, the fire refused to roar. That evening, Eleanor gathered everyone, all 23 of them now. 3 more had arrived in the last week. One carried a child, wrapped in an old army flag. Another had no voice, just hollow eyes and frostbitten cheeks that never thawed. They gathered around the stove in the center, not for food or warmth this time, but for words. Eleanor stood. Her back hurt. Her hands were swollen, but she stood straight. "I built this place because no one else would," she said. "I built it when the freeze took my family, and the men in town told me to remarry or starve." She looked around the faces, hollow, hopeful, guilty, grateful, so many kinds of tired. "I don't know what's out there. I don't know what that man saw, or what took him, but I know what's in here, and I know how we keep it." They watched her, some nodding, some crying quietly. "You will not touch the stove unless I tell you to. You will not speak to things you cannot see. You will not open the outer barn door, no matter what knocks, no matter what voice you hear." Jonah, near the edge, raised his hand like a schoolboy. "What if it's you?" She looked at him. Her eyes went soft for a breath. "It won't be." That night the fire burned blue. It shouldn't have. The flames hissed and curled low, like something wet sat beneath the logs. No one spoke. In the small hours before dawn, the baby cried once, sharply, then went silent. When Marion checked, he was ice cold, not dead, but cold, wrapped in 3 blankets, near the stove, and still cold. Eleanor held him to her chest, whispering prayers she'd long forgotten. He warmed slowly, but her arms tingled after, like something had passed through them. She sat up the rest of the night. By the time morning came, she had made a decision. She waited until the room had quieted, then pulled Jonah aside. "I'm going to block the outer barn door," she said. "With what?" "Stone, earth. I have mortar in the tool room. You'll trap us in. I'll keep them out. You think it's spirits?" She didn't answer, just looked toward the corner where the frost had begun to creep in patterns she'd never seen, like script, like ancient veins. He followed her into the barn without another word. They worked all morning, stacking old rock, sealing with packed mud, even dragging in debris from the outer fence to make it look like a cave-in from outside. By noon, the door was invisible. She lit candles in the warm room then, not for light, for warning. She placed one in each corner, told everyone, "If any candle flickers without wind, wake me." They nodded, too scared to ask what that meant. That night, All four flickered. At once, no one saw them move, but suddenly all were guttering, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Eleanor rose and took her knife from beneath the cot. Everyone followed her eyes. She pointed toward the hidden hatch in the ceiling, above the rafters where she kept the reserve food. Up there, she said. Go, quietly. Jonah hesitated. I'll go. She was last to climb, pulling the rope up after. The hatch sealed with a thump. Then the warm room was empty, but not for long. Below, something moved. Not a footstep, not a voice, a pressure, like heat being sucked from the stones, like the room itself was breathing inward. The candles extinguished. Then silence. The baby whimpered. Eleanor held her hand over his mouth gently. Hours passed. Time stretched. No one slept. And then warmth, real warmth, returned slowly. They emerged in the grey light of morning. The fire had not gone out. The stove still glowed, but the rocks were warm again. Eleanor checked the door, still sealed, no sign of entry. Whatever had come, it hadn't come through. It had been here all along, watching, waiting. She looked around the room, then said softly, "We stay." 1 more week, no one argued. Day 30 came. The sun returned. A real sun, with heat. Snow began to drip from the barn roof. Trees cracked and shifted in the thaw. Birds sang once, then again. It was over. Eleanor didn't cry. She simply walked outside, hands cracked and blackened, and stood beneath the bare sky. Jonah came to her side. "They'll go now," he said. "Some. You'll let them? They're not mine to keep." She turned to him. "But you, Jonah, if you want to stay..." "I do." He didn't hesitate. She nodded. Together they bricked over the warm room door, sealed it completely. No latch, no seam, just wall. The others helped, not with words, but with hands. They understood. It wasn't for them anymore. It had done its job. Years later, folks still spoke of that freeze, of the families that vanished, of the cabin fires that burned through the night and still froze every soul inside. But they also spoke quietly, like prayer, of one barn, of one woman, of a room that held heat like a secret and saved 24 lives. They called it strange, they called it impossible, but no one laughed again. Not about Eleanor Vance, not about the warm room, not ever.